Well, I very much would like to welcome John McCormick. John grew up in Napa and is a descendant of 5 generations of Napa Valley residents. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his master's in history from Harvard University, which produced him from their master's thesis. After a career in technology in Silicon Valley, he and his wife now own a small business. I just learned, a music store in Lafayette, California. And his book, Chinese in Napa Valley, brings to light the many hidden contributions of the Chinese community in the Napa Valley, their history, and how they were forgotten. This book is available to purchase tonight after this talk, and John will hang around and have a conversation with you and sign your book. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome everybody. Thank you very much for spending the next hour with us. I think it'll be a fun and it's just great to be here. I mean, we get to celebrate libraries and bookstores, right, and learning a little bit about a piece of history that has been very much under, I won't say unknown, but not very well known. And so I think it's going to be a fun time for us to spend together. So yeah, so we're here to talk about Chinese in the Napa Valley. Now, this is an interesting, I might seem to be a somewhat person you wouldn't expect to talk about the story. So as Karen mentioned, I have 5 generations back from St. Helena, from the first settlers came to Napa. On dad's side, mom's side, the first Italian to ever come to the Napa Valley. And so I feel like I'm rooted. I grew up in Napa, went through schools in Napa, and that led me to this book. So as Karen mentioned, so I was in the technology field for many years, retired from that early, had a bucket list to get a history degree. Ended up doing a program at Harvard, which is like you're sometimes there, sometimes here, which was great. Took this one class on the history of US-China relations because I didn't know much about that. And in doing some research, we had to write a paper on it and stumbled on this one article. I thought, oh, what there's a local angle. And I started Googling or something, Chinese Napa Valley. And it was one article written by Marion Hansen of the St. Helena Historical Society. It was just a wealth of information talking about Chinese vineyard workers in St. Helena in the late 1800s. And I was like, well, that's not right, because I grew up here, right? I was in the schools, and I remember learning about local history, and we learned about the Native Americans. We took the tour to, the Glass Mountain. We learned about the missions and the missionaries, and then it was George C. Yount and the Europeans coming in. That was the order of things. So that's not correct. And I just started peeling back the onion. And it was just a remarkable story that we were not taught. It was literally whitewashed from history. And so I ended up doing a paper on it. And then, as Karen mentioned, I kind of grew into doing a thesis on it. And as part of the thesis work, I did a presentation, a Zoom presentation, because we were in the middle of the pandemic, lockdown kind of part, to the Chinese Historical Society of America, which is based out of San Francisco. And I told the story, and I was intimidated telling the story because these are Chinese historians who were interested in this. And they were incredibly encouraging about the topic. And they said, you really should write a book because this story needs to get out. So properly, enthused, I went ahead and did the book as a popular history book. Because you could do it as an academic one, but I think the popular one is better because that's the whole point, is to get the word out and get it known in our, get this story out. So let me go just give you an idea of what we're going to talk about here. This has been a while. Before we get going on this, I do have a couple special guests in the audience. I'd like to introduce Robin Leung, who is right here in the 3rd row. Robin is the president of the Vallejo Napa Chinese Club. He and I have been working together on a project for a year or two now, and I'm going to talk about the end. But I just want to agree. So thank you very much, Robin, for being here. He and I have been kind of trying to fight the good fight, along with a woman named Hannah Harvey, who's in the back. Henry, sorry. I have a relative named that. Hannah also has done some really interesting work on this project, which I will talk about at the end, which is very exciting. But let's go ahead and perfect. Great. So now we'll set the stage. Obviously here, I've given this talk multiple times, including in San Francisco and Chinatown. So many of you don't need to worry about knowing what's going on in Napa, but clearly amazing place. We're in Napa Valley today, almost 500 wineries. We've got, $12 billion annual economic output coming out of Napa Valley alone. Now, the commercial wine industry, as we know it, started about the year, 1870 or so. And from 1870 to about 1900, not only, so the primary workforce in not only the vineyards, but also in the tanneries, in laundries, domestic workers, in mining were Chinese workers. Right? And they dominated really the labor force, but by 1900 or so, they were almost all gone. And it basically erased and gone from Napa Valley's population. And we had this replacement workforce, the Italians primarily, there were others, the Italians came in and kind of became known as kind of like the group that really our wine industry is based on. And right now, there are almost no acknowledgements of the Chinese contributions throughout Napa Valley, right? We have a plaque on First Street Bridge. If you can go there, you can see two plaques actually. But that's really about it. So it's very much not reported. So I won't. So we have our current map. We think about Napa today. You always think about the different wine areas and so on like that. But we're going to think about Napa Valley as it was in the late 1800s, where it wasn't Highway 29 going up Valley. It was Napa Valley Railroad, right, going up Valley. Now the towns are still the same, right? We still have Napa and Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena and Calistoga. We also have up in the upper right there, or the very top on the right, it says read that Calistoga mines. So we also had some mining going on in Mount St. Helena. Now, in looking at this story, one of the challenges we have is the sources. The sources are sparse. We have no writings from the Chinese themselves that worked here. Now, partially because some of them were illiterate. I mean, these were peasants. We'll talk about they were the farmers coming over, the laborers coming over. But some were literate. There were 60 Chinese language newspapers in San Francisco at the time. But for whatever reason, we don't have any writings from them themselves. And so getting at this information, we kind of have to go a little sideways. Our main source is newspapers. St. Helena Star, Napa Valley Register, Daily Calistoga, it's the same papers. And they were very active. The Chinese in the midst of all of these communities was an area of intense local interest. And the newspapers were intensely anti-Chinese. And so everything you read, while there are quite a few articles, you really have to read with a grain of salt. And so but it helps kind of establish kind of what was going on there. There are also some weekly and monthly magazines. We have some oral histories. We've got some other things going on, but it's very much of a kind of a detective novel or detective kind of way to kind of get this story out. Now, stepping back a little bit, so why were there Chinese laborers here at all, right? Like, how did they come here? So the story, Chinese originally came to California the way a lot of people came to California in search of gold, right? So in 1949, we had the gold strike, in California, and you had this wave of Chinese that came mostly from the Canton area. China was going through a fairly, it was bad economic times for a lot of people in China. It was actually illegal to emigrate from China in the 1850s, 1860s, and so on. However, as you may remember from your own history class, there was the Opium Wars, and the British kind of won the Opium Wars, basically, and had opened up a port, right, a port around Canton. And so, if Chinese peasants looking to make a better life, and there was a lot, there were the Taiping Rebellion, there were kind of clan uprisings. It was really dire economically there. Especially if you were a poor peasant, if you could make it to the Canton region, you could get on a boat and you could come to and try to find make a better life for yourself. Now, there were some Chinese that were kind of kidnapped and kind of taken against their will to places like Peru and Cuba to work on sugarcane plantations and so on. But the vast majority that came with either California or Australia came from their own free will, right? They were seeking out a better life. They took the leap to come to this place, America or Australia, and try and make it go over, right? So this group was very entrepreneurial. Now they came, by the time they got here, and the big wave came by 1852, 1853, 3 years after gold and silver were struck, a lot of the easy to mine gold was gone at that point. And so they were kind of competing against some big companies that were coming in. They were able to eke out a living throughout the gold fields. And even then, they were kind of successful for 10, 15 years. Even then, there was some resentment from the white European miners about these Chinese kind of just scraping by. And so there was a start of the anti-Chinese kind of feeling and movement among white workers. Now, there was another big push was, of course, the railroads, right? Transcontinental Railroad. And actually today is the anniversary of the golden spike being struck at Promontory Port in Utah. So it's an appropriate time. And that railroad would not have been built without Chinese labor doing amazing work, building trestles and bridges and blasting through the mountains of the Sierra Nevadas, right, to get us from Sacramento through to Utah. They couldn't get enough kind of white laborers to make that work. And so they recruited Chinese workers, mostly from Hong Kong area, to come over and help build the railroad. And so you had the miners come over, you had railroad workers come over. The railroad was done in 1869. So then you get to do smaller railroad work, but you had more and more. The word got back, there was opportunity in California particularly. And so you had lots of Chinese immigrant workers come over. And the next big thing was agriculture, right? So that was the big thing because, then and now, California is like the breadbasket of the nation. But then as now, there were problems, right? Some of the problems was that land was expensive. Transportation was expensive, marketing was expensive, getting access to capital was expensive because a lot of capital markets were on the East Coast and in Europe. And so the one thing that these vineyard owners and all of them could control was labor cost. And the Chinese were less expensive laborers because they were actually prohibited from doing a lot of the things. So they had to take whatever jobs they could get. 1870s was a pivotal decade in the history of Napa Valley and thus the history of Chinese labor in Napa Valley. So in the 60s, where we had the Civil War going on, there was a lot of disruption of trade from the East Coast in Europe. And so a lot of these nascent wineries that were coming up all around the Napa Valley had a chance to kind of experiment without a lot of competition. And so they were able to kind of start figuring out what sort of grapes worked and what kind of things worked in there. And that was the 60s and the 70s. And then in 1878, this blight called phylloxera, which is kind of, as you know anything about wine, which is kind of decimated, and it hit Europe and decimated the vineyards in France. And this was reported on, and the vineyard owners, especially in St. Helena, but around the valley, said, this is our chance, right? We took this relatively small industry, and now is our chance to really double down. There's no competition from Europe, let's make it work. And so they won this giant planting spree and planted vineyards all over Napa Valley. And there was only one group that could satisfy the labor requirements for these vineyards. It was the Chinese that were here. So they brought in Chinese came in from all over the area, apparently from San Francisco, but everywhere else to work in the vineyards. Now, at this time, the Chinese workers, all Chinese, were suffering under multiple levels of discrimination. The most notorious one is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is notorious in the kind of history of U.S. immigration law and history. And it is the first law passed in the United States that actually excluded a particular group based on their race and national origin, which was Chinese. But California in particular was incredibly racist. They actually updated their constitution in 1879, 1880, and there were only like 26 articles, I want to say. And the entire article, Article 19, was titled Chinese. And it prohibited Chinese from working in corporations, working for government, and so on, saying that the Chinese were just kind of a scourge on our state. And there were, obviously in Napa, St. and Calistoga all had eventually anti-Chinese leagues, and they reflected the national trend going on. Now, why was California and the nation so anti-Chinese beyond just the overall racism that was going on? And it's an interesting story because effectively, if you think back to what was happening in the mining going on back in the 1880s, so on, 1870s, 1880s, California was very much the Wild West, like the epitome of the Wild West. And so there's a lot of people moving in, very chaotic. There was one group that was effectively organized politically, or the main group was the White Working Man's Organization. Now they only made up 3 or 4% of the population, but they were organized and they were a single issue block, no Chinese labor. Now, California at that time was more or less evenly divided kind of between the two political parties, and the governor would switch every couple of terms back and forth. But because it was so evenly split, this one group, this 3 or 4% of the population could actually swing the election. And so the politicians would kind of gin up and say, well, how could that be more stridently anti-Chinese to get the vote? And so they would keep, so you'd have these kind of very, more and more, they would kind of ratchet up the intensity. And the United States also was fairly split. And so where California went, they would also help switch the national picture. So we had this incredibly tail wagging the dog a little bit as far as what was happening at the state and the national level. Now, if we look at the census, which unfortunately, all we have to go on population is census, and even now, the census is notorious for undercounting underrepresented minority groups, and we have to assume it was much worse back in the 1880s. But we can kind of see, we can actually look at just the population of Napa Valley in the 1860, where 5,000 white residents, 1990, 15,000, we had significant growth. The maximum Chinese population that we have in the census is 1880, and it was 907 people. So it was actually never, at least even those numbers, more than 7 or 8% of the population. That may have been uncounted by a factor of 2, we don't know. It was still it never was a majority, but the rate of growth of the Chinese workers was significantly higher than the rate of greater growth of other groups. And so it got people kind of gets nervous. Now we get this information from the census, which is not digitized. You had to go through manually and count through all this information in the counties in the census in the Napa County in 1870, 1880. But what we get actually, just looking even what's recorded, the sheer number of different jobs that the Chinese were doing at that time. Now it spanned all the way from the general laborer and cooks, but also working on the railroad, tanneries, laundry. It's incredible how the plethora of different kinds of work that they were doing. So given that background, so why were they successful? And they actually were quite successful. I think that is what we have to keep in mind is how successful they were given the headwinds, the discriminatory headwinds that they were facing at the national, state, and local level. So let's first look in the countryside, and we start with wine because wine is what we're all about now. So why were the Chinese successful in the wine industry? And we hear from the vineyard owners themselves. There was actually this quite interesting that a group called the Farmers Club out of St. Helena, which was the center of the wine industry then. And they were talking about and debating like the value of having Chinese workers work on their vineyards. We have to have Chinese workers, and it was pretty clear that they did. The primary reason was price and cost. So they would pay the average wage for a Chinese worker working on the vineyard was $1 a day. The wage for a white worker was $1.50 a day. So you're talking about 50% reduction. Or you could pay the white worker $1 a day if you gave them room and board, right? And so the Chinese workers were significantly cheaper, but not only cheaper, they were actually more reliable. So the white workers, there was this reputation of Wild West again. So it's kind of a hard driving group, right? That was out here, and there was this notion of as soon as they hear the white workers, as soon as they heard of another gold strike or silver strike of the Sierra Nevadas, they would drop their hoe and run up and try to strike it rich. The Chinese workers, though, were actually considered reliable, and actually, if they signed and agreed to do a labor contract, they fulfilled the contract. And this was noted from back when they did the worked on the railroad and so on. So they were considered a very reliable and almost kind of dependable workforce. They also didn't drink as nearly as much as the white workers, so they were easier to kind of manage. It showed up on time, so it was just preferable beyond cost for a lot of the different areas. And the other thing, which is kind of surprising, so if you look at this picture, this is a picture of a vineyard in the 1800s. That doesn't look like vineyards today, right? If you notice, right, all the vines, you can see they're actually on the ground. They grew more like blackberries and so on. And so the way you had to pick them, you had to stoop over, like the gentleman on the far right is doing to pick the grapes. This was known as stoop labor, and it was considered demeaning by a lot of the white laboring class. They would not resort to stoop labor. The Chinese, because of the culture, they didn't have any, it was just work to do. They didn't have that kind of aversion. So despite everything else, they also were willing to do this work that was considered demeaning for a lot of the white laborers. So they were clearly, have a very attractive labor force. They did more though than working in just vineyards. They also did other things like wine caves. So these are pictures that I took at Schramsberg Vineyards Winery, which is one of the few places, there are a couple, but it's one of the few places where we still actually have physical artifacts of the Chinese, of the work they did. And this is wine caves that the Chinese workers dug out, dynamite as well as other means, and they're still in use today. In fact, on the far right, you can still see the pick marks for where these caves were dug out. It took, they have 2 sets of caves, each took about a year. You can go up there if you want and have some great champagne and sparkling wine, and tour the caves today because they are in use and just remarkable. So interestingly, so we also talk, another big thing in 1878 was, the wine. I think there's going to be the next speaker here is going to talk about this. But one of the big things that kind of got Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley on the map for winery was this article in Harper's Weekly. So this very famous article, Vintage in California, that was in 1878, where the editors of Harper's Weekly had heard, hey, there's this new kind of movement, new wine coming out of California that's pretty good. They sent an author, a writer, and a sketch artist to Napa and Sonoma to kind of see what was going on. And they did this big spread about the wine industry in California, or Napa and Sonoma, which helped drive a lot of interest. And during the interviews, the authors or the wine owners were kind of really hesitant about like talking about their workforce, was the Chinese, because they didn't want the rest of the country thinking they had foreign workers working in the vineyards. They were worried what the backlash would be. Well, the sketch artist kind of did his thing, and he came back, and this was the picture that was printed in Harper's Weekly. And you see on the upper right, you've got you got Chinese workers, in their hats stomping on the grapes, and there was this giant hue and cry about this. But there's all these foreign diseases coming in, and oh my gosh, how can we do this? Now, of course, the interesting thing is, this is not actually how wine was done at the time. The wine industry, even in 1870, 1880, was much more sophisticated. They had giant presses. People were not stomping on grapes, so it was fake news back then, I guess. But it was a lot of riling up of things, and there was a lot of pressure from the winery owners, the vineyard owners, to fire their workforce, and they would not do it. So they stood firm. They actually said, whether it was altruistic or whether it was self-interested, who knows? But they stood firm, and they said, we're not going to fire these workers because they're critical to our success. The backlash of that, though, the anti-Chinese forces were frustrated with that, so that got them to actually include the anti-Chinese article in the California Constitution. So it's interesting that Napa vineyards, wineries did stand up, but that's actually one of the reasons that caused it to be in the Constitution. Now, grapes were not the only crop destined for alcoholic beverages that showed that was important for reliant on Chinese labor. Another one was hop fields or hop yards, right? Because hops go in for part of beer, right? Now, beer was mostly a European thing at this time, and unlike vineyards, which were kind of throughout the Napa Valley, centered on St. Helena, but throughout the Napa Valley, hop yards were only in St. Helena, and they were all staffed by Chinese laborers. Because hop fields, actually, it's hard to see, this is a sketch of it at the time, but hop yards required a pole, a 10-foot tall pole that's planted in the ground, the hops grow up, and there's 1,500 poles per acre. So it is it's an expensive kind of crop. It's a highly capital intensive crop. And so again, they were really focused on low labor costs. And so it was exclusively Chinese labor that worked in all the hop yards in the Napa Valley. Now, mining was a big deal. Now, there is no silver or gold in the Napa Valley, or no meaningful amounts, but there was quicksilver, which is liquid mercury. And so that was the mining that was done, and mostly in the kind of the shadow of the foothills of Mount St. Helena. This also, in quicksilver, unlike silver and gold, there was it was not economically, it was always a hit or miss operation. So again, you want the lowest cost labor possible. The Chinese were willing to do this hard, backbreaking, dangerous work. We do know a bit about these. There was the Great Western Mine, which was in between Calistoga and Middleton. It's not there anymore, of course. That's where it's located. And the daughter of the mine supervisor actually wrote a book about her experiences, and she has a couple chapters on the Chinese. So it's actually knows some things about them. They were all in that particular mine. There were two camps. They're called Camp Number 1 and Brown China Camp, which housed the miners. And again, the passage of the California Constitution, late 1879, caused the whole mine to shut down because they were not allowed to work in California corporations, and the mine could not exist without the Chinese miners. Now, this is a picture of the camp there, and the miners had to build these shacks themselves. There's no running water. It's very rustic. That's where they had to live because it was too far away from Calistoga or anything to go regularly. And we also have a picture. This is a picture. It's hard to see, but this is a picture of all the mining staff. In the middle, you can see some dresses. These are the white, they're the kind of supervisors, and they work at the hospital, the pharmacy, and so on site. These are their wives. And then you have the miners, the Chinese miners all around them. And of course, also, the mining, when you think of mine mercury, is very dangerous, a lot of mercury poisoning. It's a really horrible job to have, but they did it, and they made it work. Now, in towns,
it was a little bit different, a little bit easier. I mean, much like today, right? If you get a chance of working, working in a field or working in a house, it's better in a house. The domestic sphere, the big thing was being a domestic or I should say a particular job that was fairly common. It was being a domestic servant. Now they called these at the time China boys, no matter how old a person was, the servant that worked there. And it was considered a very kind of relatively desirable profession if you were a Chinese worker, because it was easier than working in some of the dangerous areas outside. We do know a few things about this. We do know there's a man named Ah Hing, who was a cook for the Lyman household. And the Lymans they owned a small farm just north of St. Helena. And Ah Hing worked for them from 1884 to 1919 as kind of the cook and eventually almost like the general manager of the entire farm. We do have letters from the boys that were raised at the time, and they talk about Ah Hing as really kind of the general manager. You know, he was the one that made sure that the boys did their homework on time. He was the cook when they had other Chinese workers come in to work the vegetable gardens at on the farm. Ah Hing supervised them. He made sure that everything got done. So he was, you know, it's very much one of those. I think when anybody kind of works for you in a kind of very intimate situation, it became kind of part of the family. He would go back and forth between China and St. Helena, and the boys talk about when they wrote their diaries, talking about how they always kind of liked it when Ah Hing went away. It was kind of like the substitute teacher coming in. They'd have a replacement worker who was never as harsh on them as Ah Hing was. So that was good. He eventually had to go back. He went back permanently in 1919 when his eyesight failed, so he couldn't do the work anymore. But it is interesting kind of to see that how that worked. Well, I should mention actually, just because we're here, look at the census, what was going on around Napa. So Napa is relatively integrated, especially compared to St. Helena and Calistoga. And you can look at all of the housing, the houses on 2nd Street and 3rd Street and 1st Street. Many of them had Chinese live-in servants, and so it's interesting to kind of see like every 2 or 3 houses there was a Chinese person living there that was doing a lot of domestic servants. And so you can just imagine what's going on during the day when things are walking around the neighborhoods downtown. It was probably a fairly integrated look, you know, because there were a lot of Chinese workers working and doing a lot of household maintenance. In addition, we have downtown the Sawyer Tannery, right, which was, so back in actually the 1880s, Napa was much more famous for its leather than for its wine. And the Sawyer Tannery was the main driver here. So if any of you, I know that's right, heard of Napa leather, especially like it's used a lot now, like one of the European luxury cars, but NAPPA leather was trademarked right here by Sawyer Tannery. And that whole tannery was built on the back of Chinese laborers. They start with like 4 Chinese laborers and 1 white laborer, and they grew proportionally. And so it also could not have succeeded without the need for Chinese labor. So that was quite interesting. Here's a sketch of the tannery at the time right along the Napa River. Now, unfortunately, Sawyer Tannery, while they were an early adopter of Chinese labor, in 1886, when the anti-Chinese movement really kind of reached its peak in Napa, they were the first big company to fire all of their workers. Unfortunately, so they didn't equip themselves, but they could not have succeeded at all without Chinese laborers. The other thing is laundries, right? So there's kind of this trope, and it's not untrue, about laundries kind of being owned by Chinese. This is important, and of course, back in the 1880s, right? In the 1870s, you have the washing machines, right? So if you could, when we're doing laundry is hard work, you could do it manually. So if you could afford it at all, you wouldn't have somebody else do your laundry. And the laundries were dominated, by Chinese owners in Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga. And the city fathers and city leaders hated the fact that the Chinese dominated the industry, and they felt that it should be by white, but interesting, white women. So this was a thing where it was kind of considered improper, or kind of somehow for a white man to own a laundry, but because the laundry was in the women's sphere, domestic sphere, it's okay for women to own it. So it's interesting, and we actually have ads from the register here, which talks about white laundry, and that's the title of the ad. And we're prepared to do laundry work without the aid of Chinese and guarantee satisfaction. So like that was their entire. And we have other ads in St. Helena says, "Give your laundry to a deserving white woman." I mean, it's just incredible that that was their claim to fame. That was their main value proposition. And interestingly, the same issue that has this ad has this article which talks about how the white laundry folded because they couldn't compete with the Chinese competition. So it is good. And we have the Sam Key Laundry, which some of you may know. It was originally in Chinatown, moved to now I know where the courthouse is, and then eventually was with the current location until the 60s or something. Sam Key, the Napa City fathers, fathers at that point, really hated the idea of this, and they passed an ordinance to ban Chinese from owning laundry. Sam Key was arrested for owning laundry. And went to jail. He was bailed out the next day. And the Chinese Six Companies, which is an organization out of San Francisco, Thomas Riordan, you may have heard of, he represented Sam. They took it to the California Supreme Court and actually got the ordinance overturned. It was unfair and unconstitutional, and that court finding was cited in 22 other cases around the country about pushing back against anti-Chinese legislation. So Sam Key did. The court though business and the most kind of celebrate business was China stores. So this was kind of like this a China store. It's like a grocery store. We're talking about Chinese merchants, but not just a grocery store. Right? This was kind of like the core of culture for the Chinese working. And there was, they were Napa, St. Helena, and Calistoga in Chinatowns. And it served as not only a grocery store, but a great pharmacy, as a bank, as kind of a hostel, as an employment agency, as a general gathering place. This is a picture of the Lahing China store, which was in our Chinatown, which is just 2 blocks that way or so. And the merchants were actually a different kind of class. And we'll talk a little bit in just a minute about laborers and that they would have a lot of restrictions, including they could bring their families over. Merchants could bring their families over, and actually were not excluded from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So they actually had some additional power, but they were very important. They were definitely kind of the leading citizens in Chinatown and eventually kind of in the whole town itself. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of success here. They had legal success, as I mentioned, they pushed back against the local ordinances from Chinese laundries. They also, as I mentioned, we had the California Constitution that included that article about anti-Chinese, and several of the Quicksilver mines, Great Western Mine and the Sulphur Springs mine, both had to close down because they had a lot of Chinese workers. The Sulphur Springs mine took that and challenged it in court to the Supreme Court and got the California Constitution overturned. Saying that was illegal to kind of prohibit the Chinese from working in a corporation. And so they actually got the whole article overturned. So it's very kind of important, I think, legal victories. Economically, the peak was in 1887 or so is when the economic power peaked. So we think about it, we had the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which at that point stopped all Chinese laborers from coming into the country. That's basically what it did. But so laborers were forced to stop, they couldn't come in anymore. There's a few loopholes that was all fixed by 1883. And then at the same time, though, as we know, we had this giant planting spree around with vineyards and everything, and Napa and the whole Napa Valley was growing like crazy. And so what happens when demand continues to go up and supply is fixed, right? Prices go up. And the number of vineyards grew from 48 to 175 between 1880 and 1886, a giant growth. And the Chinese workers realized this, and they actually went on strike. And they went on strike, and they actually got a raise. That went from $1.25 to $1.50. Which is great, so much for this docile workforce, right? They actually knew they had economic power, they took advantage of it. The hop yard workers saw them, and they went on strike the following month and got a raise to $1.25 a day. So it was great. It was really their kind of the peak of economic power that they had, again, because they were so in demand and there were no additional laborers coming in. So culturally, as I mentioned and alluded to, the way kind of they kept the culture alive was through Chinatowns. And there were major Chinatowns here in Napa and St. Helena, mostly, and then a small one in Calistoga. And we do know some things from them. So I talked about the newspapers and how newspapers had a very strong anti-Chinese bias, but we do get some interesting glimpses. Like we actually have an ad put in by Ginger, who owned a China store, the main China store in St. Helena, where it says Chinese New Year, firecrackers is 2 words, will be burned Sunday afternoon next about 3 or 4 o'clock in front of my store in Chinatown, St. Helena. The public generally are invited to be present. And this is a fairly big deal. Napa's Chinatown was fairly integrated. There were actually, I think there's a lot of stories about, people of whites, Chinese, everybody kind of shopping there. St. Helena was much more segregated. And so for the townspeople of St. Helena to come to Chinatown was a big deal. So that was kind of an interesting thing. So we do get a little glimpse of what was going on there. But generally speaking, Chinatowns, they were self-contained properties. Now, the Chinese did not own property. Now, it's like legally they may have been able to, but they just I think politically, socially, culturally, they did not. They did not own property. The Chinatown areas were owned by white landowners who then leased the properties and the buildings to the Chinese residents there. There was also talk about, and it was interesting to see the funeral processions that went on also gave the rest of the community kind of a chance to see the Chinese. Whenever there was a funeral, which was a big deal, it's a big deal everywhere, but certainly in China, there were certain big deal there would be a hearse that would contain the deceased. It'd be followed, they talk about, followed by usually there was a band, followed by 2 rows of mourners, and then another band at the end, followed by carts which contain all the food for the feast. And the band would make lots of music, it would scare away evil spirits. And so it wound through the communities around Chinatown. So I got to see a lot of that. When eventually they were buried, we actually have some records. So Tulake Cemetery, there's a section in Tulake that's called the county section. And that is where the Chinese were buried. Now, there are 7 tombstones that still remain. They're actually in Chinese, so you can see them today. All the other tombstones were wood that they have over the years disintegrated. And so apparently they don't really know where all how many bodies there are, or what was buried up there. So there's no additional burials up in that area. But we can actually see the 7 that are there, and these are the merchants. These are kind of the upper kind of class that are able to afford the tombstone. Ideally, if many of the Chinese, when they came over, their goal wasn't to stay. Their goal was you'd come over, you'd make your money, you'd go back to China to your family. But not everybody was able to do that. And people died here just accidents and just healthcare wasn't nearly as good. And some were disinterred, we have records that were going to go back to China, but some made Napa, St. Helena, so on the final resting place. St. Helena Cemetery, they have an area called it's called Chinese Potter's Field. Now, Potter's Field is normally an area for like Indian people. In this particular case, all classes of the Chinese that were buried in this one area. They don't have small markers. We don't have tombstones. And unfortunately, in some are disinterred, we have records of that. But in 1930, there was a giant flood that went down Silver Creek and washed away about half the bodies in that area. So we don't actually know who is there. And they don't really know who all is buried in there either. They have the records, we know the names, but we don't know exactly what's going, who is there. And then kind of wrapping up, also culturally, religion was, important to them, certainly. They're doubts. They have temples, which the English are called joss houses, but they were the temples. And when Chinatown got a temple, that was really the sense of, that's when they kind of made it. That's when Chinatown was really on the map. Now, the temples were built by an organization called the Chinese Freemasons. So the Chinese Freemasons were a fraternal organization. They were originally kind of an they're a revolutionary group in China that was against the current emperor. And when we had all the immigration come over from China, this group came over as well. They would meet secretly and kind of plot and conspire against the emperor. There was some worry in San Francisco, like, what's this group doing? They're meeting secretly, and so they sent some reporters down to kind of see what's going on, and they found out they were just arguing, conspiring against the emperor of China, which the Americans didn't care about. And so the reporting was, oh, don't worry about it. This is just a group. They're harmless, like the Freemasons. Well, they liked that alliteration, right? Because hey, the Freemasons are Ben Franklin and George Washington, so they called themselves the Chinese Freemasons. But what it really was, it was a fraternal organization that was about supporting each other. And they would actually, there was a talk about half of the workers, the men workers in Napa Valley were members of the Freemasons. You had to kind of sign an oath to help your brother. You paid money when you joined, that would go to a funeral fund, would help with the funeral expenses. And they really took the place of the family in a lot of these kind of rituals of like funerals and so on that were so important. They were very important. And they would fund the temples in Chinatowns. And this actually, this is the altar that was in Napa's Chinatown that was rescued. And we'll talk about when Chinatown was destroyed, Shut Chan was the son of the owner of the China House. Got the altar, was able to rescue it, and it's in San Francisco at the Chinese Historical Society of America Museum. So it's available to be seen. Now, churches are interesting. So the churches also had a role in this. Now, not surprisingly, of course, especially back then, certainly the role of Christian church was evangelicals. They were interested in converting the Chinese from Taoism to Christianity. And in 1883, there was an old Baptist church. It's not there anymore on Franklin Street. It purchased $400 and was converted and became the Chinese Mission Chapel. And it was the place where that they would then, it was taken over and run by the First Presbyterian Church. Still there, of course. And it was the Sunday school, and it was the area in which they would do an education for the few Chinese children that were in Napa Valley. And by 1884, the Sunday school was averaging 20 students a week. And they actually hosted a bilingual Chinese New Year celebration in 1889. So it was fairly well attended and fairly successful. There was, and it actually served as the only school for Chinese children through 1890. So before that, the schools would not educate the Chinese children. This was their only education. After 1890, the school district opened up, and you had Chinese children were allowed to attend schooling. This is a picture of Chinatown. We don't actually have a photograph. We have a sketch that was made in 1927 before it was raised. And it was actually, there's still here because it was along the Napa River. It's kind of where First Street Bridge, between the First Street Bridge and Second and Third Street Bridge, there on Napa. On the Napa River, it's been reshaped since since the Chinatown was there, and so we did flood occasionally, but it was kind of fairly ramshackle. As you can see, it was all kind of different kinds of shacks, all in a somewhat haphazard way. This is the picture. We do have this picture, which is Chanhua Jack, who's there in the upper right. He was the owner of the China store, the merchant, the kind of leading man in Chinatown. This is his family. The key merchants were allowed to have families. This was his family that was standing in front of the temple in Napa's Chinatown during Chinese New Year's parade. So we do have that, which is very, very nice. This is, we don't have a picture, we have a diorama actually of Calistoga's Chinatown. If you ever go to the Sharpston Museum, they have this amazing diorama of Calistoga, what it looked like in the 1880s. They have a little side diorama of what Chinatown looked like. And so here, if you can imagine, that's Lincoln Avenue up there that goes out to what is now Highway 29. And you can see Chinatown like literally on the wrong side of the tracks, right? A lot of the Chinese were worked on the railroads, and this is where they lived. And we have maps of the time, and this does more or less line up with what buildings were that were in Chinatown. And so it's interesting that you can imagine how loud it was, and so on, and separated physically from the rest of the community. Right? So it was very separate, but all indications and all the what we have, it was an amicable kind of situation there. Different in St. Helena. So St. Helena was really, I think, a flashpoint of anti-Chinese sentiment in Napa Valley. We do a photograph. This is a photograph of part of Chinatown in St. Helena. So Chinatown was located, if you're going, it was south of St. Helena. You know where Gotts is? That area right there is where Chinatown was on the west side of the Highway 29 or the railroad. And owned by a man named John Gillum. The land was owned by that. He purchased the land. It was a gravel pit next to the railroad, and he would lease out the land, and the Chinese would build two-story structures. And these were stores, houses, opium dens, gambling establishments, also a little town really there. And then when it was originally purchased, St. Helena was fairly removed from Chinatown, but of course St. Helena was growing a lot during this time. And while Napa had a fairly good relationship with this Chinatown, the St. Helena fathers and founding fathers, the city council, hated Chinatown in Napa, because it's like when you drove up going up Valley, either on the railroad or a stagecoach, this was the first thing you saw. Now, as I mentioned, like there's no families here really. It's all men, and you can imagine single men living together. They don't make a whole lot of money. There's no sewage system. It didn't smell very good. It was fairly ramshackle. It was not an attractive place. And so St. Helena people they wanted to get rid of Chinatown. And they kept pressuring John Gillum, well, get rid of Chinatown. And he was saying, well, this is like the major source of my wealth. I can't just get rid of everybody. And so the battle for Chinatown. So it was interesting. So this group of anti-Chinese business people got together and purchased the land from John Gillum in 1886. And there was a celebratory article in the St. Helena Star talking about, hallelujah, we're going to get rid of the Chinese that are in our midst, even though the Chinese did all the work in St. Helena that made it what it was. And interestingly, so they, this group got together, they purchased the land, and they told all the Chinese, you gotta leave. But the Chinese were living there, had leases that John Gill had signed that either had future expiration dates or no expiration dates. They took this group to businesses to court and fought back for 20 years with and during this whole time, and didn't leave, and not only didn't leave, didn't pay rent during that time. It was a nice little outcome of that particular thing. But during this time, actually, we had this rise in anti-Chinese sentiment. And it's not a coincidence that it peaked more or less at the same time that the economic power of the Chinese labor force peaked as well. So you can look at, we don't need to read these, of course, but you look at articles through this time, and as early as 1874, you start reading the articles like, oh, we have more Chinese in our midst. Do we like this? What do we feel about this? And so on, all the way in the mid-80s, anti-Chinese leagues forming, and so on. Chinese must go. You start getting this more and more vitriolic, economically saying, oh, they're taking jobs away. Now, of course, they weren't taking jobs away. There were way too many jobs to be done anyway, but this was kind of the thing about, oh, they're taking jobs away from the white worker. At the same time, there was a parallel rise looking on the morality side. So that the Chinese were a bad influence because they had opium dens, right? It's like, oh, we don't like opium. Now, of course, they don't really talk about all the bars and saloons that are around for the white workers. And so you'd have these ordinances, laws passed by the St. Helena and Napa governments trying to ban opium dens. And so they passed these laws, and then and same thing with gambling. There's a lot of gambling going on. So you have gambling houses because gambling was a pastime of peasants and lower income people in China, and that came here. So gambling was very prevalent. And so they'd have these laws passed against opium and against gambling. And you'd have they pass the laws, you'd have the police go in, they'd round up everybody, and they would always end up arresting all the Chinese people and ignoring all the white people that were there. And there were a ton of white men and boys that were there in these opium dens and gambling halls, and even the Register, which is a pretty anti-Chinese newspaper, actually called them out on this and said, hey, what's the point of passing these laws? We're only enforcing it and arresting half the people that are there. But certainly it was an overall sign of just this rising anti-Chinese mentality, really. But by 1900 or so, almost all the Chinese are gone anyway. Now they're gone because demographics, you can't cheat demographics, right? And so when you cut off the spigot, 1882 of all the laborers coming in, and as I mentioned, there's no families, right? So 1882 is the big law that anybody who does anything about immigration kind of history knows that. There was a previous law in 1875 called the Page Act that actually limited Chinese women from immigrating. And it was kind of down the guise of, we don't want women to go compute coming in, but there was a specific strategy to say, well, we probably have to have the Chinese workers come in because we need them to help our burgeoning nation grow, but we don't want them to stay. So we don't want families to come here. So we're going to make it so the men can come over, they can work, but they have to go home, or they will go home. And so it was this intentional push to keep families from coming here. And so there were almost no families, and there were almost no children. As I mentioned, we know about 20 children in the Napa Valley, Chinese children in like the 1880s, 1870s, and we had 1,000 Chinese residents at least, right? So it's a very small percentage because the merchants bring up their families. We saw Chanwell Jack and his children, but the laborers couldn't. And so, but you had the labor force that was cut off in 1882. 18 years later, well, a lot of laborers are either old, right? But they moved back to China. They've gotten old and went to easier work in Chinatowns in San Francisco or Oakland, or they died, right? We don't really know what happened to them, but they're almost all gone. And you also have these replacement workers coming in, primarily the Italians coming in that they were fairly despised, even though they're European, fairly despised group. And so they took over a lot of the low-ranking jobs that the Chinese had filled. In addition, in this time, 1890s or so, you started having this phylloxera, which the St. Helena vineyards in particular were very happy that happened to Europe, came over to the Napa Valley. And so you had a lot of the vineyards starting to gain disease and going away. There was also this economic depression. And so a lot of the vineyards and wineries started going bankrupt. So the Italians came in, and the Italians, a lot of them had done wineries, back in the old country. So they came over, they knew how to do the wine. they also were allowed to purchase land, which the Chinese didn't have, and they could run as a family. So they'd be like owner operators, right? So they could actually grow and do things differently that the Chinese were not allowed to do. And also, when they replanted all the plants after phylloxera, they planted the vines further apart, so you can have mechanical tools go through, so you didn't need all the labor, and they put them up on the, they strung up with the wires that the grapes would go on, so you didn't need to stoop over to pick things up. So the whole kind of character of vineyard working changed, and so they were able to do the Italians were able to do the same work with less labor, so you didn't need the kind of surge of labor that the Chinese were putting on. And so that's what we get today, right? So this is the Visit Napa Valley website homepage from last year, and I'm just it actually says, this fall, one lucky winner we whisked away on the luxury wine country vision, highlighting Napa Valley's rich Italian heritage, right? California's wine country has deep Italian roots. One can only imagine the pleasure which Italian immigrants first discovered this region in the mid-19th century, the familiar territory, and so on. So the Italians did actually save the wine industry. There's no doubt they did it around 1900, but it was built on the backs of the Chinese, who was there first, but weren't allowed to take advantage of it the same way the Italians were. So it's really not to denigrate the Italians' contributions. It's just say, hey, it's important to actually, acknowledge the Chinese contributions. So that's basically the story. There are some happier, it's a little bit that's happened. I do want to say we did this talk, our first talk in January after the book came out, and the Napa Valley the Napa County Historical Society. I did get a call from the Napa Valley Unified School District the following week, and they are going to put in the story of the Chinese in the schools. It's going to go in the ethnic studies class that's being done now. It's going to go in next year. So it's very exciting. That's going to happen. We're also working on a sign that we're an informational sign that we'll put on. So the Moon Gate parklet. Well, that's actually supposed to honor the Chinese, but I think they ran out of money or something. There's no signage on there. And so with Robin's help, with Robin and Robin has reached out, and we have been working on that project for a couple of years, trying to get that sign put up there that actually overlooks where Chinatown was and talks about the history of the sign. We are close to getting it approved, I think. And I want to call Hannah over there, who actually did the design, artwork on it. It looks beautiful. When that sign goes up, they're going to love it. And Hannah's work there. She also did some work around the Native Americans signage that we're going to have around there. So it's actually very exciting. So we thank her for that work. And we're also working with the city of St. Helena. We're looking to get a monument put in the cemetery. Actually, just we're listing all the names of all the Chinese that died there. So we are making some progress. It's actually it's slow progress, but there is acknowledgement, and it's exciting. And so it's really great. And this May is Asian American API Heritage Month, and so I think it's an appropriate time to think about the contributions. But anyway, that's the story. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes to think so.
At this time, what was the size of the San Francisco Chinatown, its influence on Calistoga, Napa, St. Helena, and why didn't the Exclusion Act wipe out Oakland and San Francisco?
Well, that's a good point. I don't think the size. The Chinatown in San Francisco was definitely a place where a lot of the Chinese would live, and then they would surge out to work in Napa, like come back to San Francisco. Chinatown, it was much more of a merchant class, and the merchant class wasn't nearly as affected by the Exclusion Act as the laboring class. So Napa was almost all laborers, and so they were definitely shut out. If you were a merchant, you were allowed to still immigrate to California, go back and forth, and bring your wife back, and so on. So I think that's why they weren't but San Francisco Chinatown was definitely the heart of the Chinese experience in the United States. And the main organization was from the Chinese 6 companies based in San Francisco. They actually would help sponsor these. A lot of these men have come over. They would actually lend them money so they could afford the trip over here, and then in fact, didn't take them. They would sail back on them. But no, that's why I think that's why they were not quite as dramatic as some of these more agricultural areas. That's a great question. Yes.
In your research, did you find that the Chinese may have, when that railroad did make it into Utah, were they employed then by William Randolph Hearst to work his Park City silver mines? Even it went straight through?
I don't know about that. They may. I don't know about that. I do know. Good question, actually. I do know they did do a lot of work on the railroads here, though. So if we think about the Napa Valley Railroad, the spine that went up valley, and then there were actually tributary kind of small scale, small gauge railroads that went sideways, like up into the mountains. The Chinese, because they had such experience with the railroads from the transcontinental, were actually employed, and it was the largest employer, single employer was the railroad in Napa. And the Napa, they actually had a dormitory in downtown Napa that housed the Chinese that worked in the railroads. So they actually did that, and it was apparently quite an easy going up valley. It was so flat. They were able to go up valley in like 2 or 3 years and build the entire railroad. It was crazy. But then when they went like in the foothills, that required a lot more building of trestles and leveling things out. But no, the Chinese did all that. So I know they were definitely involved in the railroads here in Napa Valley. I don't know. You would imagine they were probably employed everywhere in the mining industries throughout. Yeah.
They were, after the Transcontinental Railroad, they built the railroads going up to Oregon and all of the ones that went through Canada. They built a lot of spurs. They built a section that, the Transcontinental Railroad started in Sacramento. But they didn't finish the section that came to our area. And they built all of that section through Niles Canyon and into San Francisco.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
John, thank you very much for doing this. And you've mentioned 3 of the towns and cities in the valley on numerous occasions. What one absent from most of the talk, which is Yountville.
Right.
The reason for that?
We don't know much about Yountville. The only Yountville was almost absent from anything I read. The only thing I know is they did in 1886, which was the rise of the anti-Chinese agitation. There were actually groups formed in St. Helena and Napa. There was also one group formed in Yountville. And so there was a brief mention of a Chinatown in Yountville, just like one line. But I've never found anything else about Yountville. That there also was a Chinatown in Rutherford. Because Rutherford at that time was actually it's a pretty sleepy town now. It actually was a spur on, it was an end point of the railroad, so there actually was a fairly a relatively decent Chinese population there. But no, Yountville, I have nothing on Yountville basically, other than like one article that talked about an interesting anti-Chinese group was actually started by the Napa County DA. So anyway,
Thank you.
yes.
I saw some of the newspaper clippings. I've heard the term, but I don't fully understand. Celestials.
Yes, so it's interesting when you read all of these articles, they never talk about Chinese immigrant laborers. There's always kind of fairly some derogatory terms. John Chinaman was kind of popular, really, which are not great. But celestials was just another term that they used. That was just a term that they used to refer to the Chinese workers or the Chinese people living there. That was just a somewhat derogatory. I mean, it doesn't seem that derogatory to me. It seemed, I think it was a derogatory term.
Question about modern Chinese.
Yes.
Figureheads. You mentioned about St. Helena and the Dots.
Yes.
Restaurant next to that. Prior to COVID, there was the Yao family tasting room.
That's right.
Was he aware that he built that at the old Chinatown?
Yeah, that's good. I do not know. I really kind of focus I know there's Paul G. There's several Chinese vendors today that actually are in Napa Valley. They're actually doing some work, but I am not aware of that. There's probably a whole separate history that should be written about with the Chinese in that. Because what happened, everybody kind of, it all went downhill, but then in the 40s and 50s, there's whole kind of resurgence. So there's more, but I don't know the details on that, unfortunately. Yes.
Did you do all of your research in English?
Yeah, so for better or for worse, as I mentioned, there's no writings from them. So from the workers there, so there was actually, I won't say not a need, but there were nothing to translate really. The only thing that I had to work at translating, which in the book, was if you remember the altar had some Chinese characters on there, and so I actually did get that translated. It was actually kind of it was kind of some legendary talking about some kind of poetry and spirituality. But no, so this was unfortunately a thing where you didn't really need to know Chinese to kind of do the work, which was helpful.
I'm wondering about, was there mail service or
Yes.
anything between here and China?
Yes, that's where yes, there was this here, the store served as mail. And so they were actually, and they were people that could write, that even the people that were couldn't write would actually dictate to write letters back and forth to China. So they do exist. There are probably villages in China that may have them, but we don't have any record as far as like.
That's a lot.
I know, such a loss, yes. Well, and again, I mean, as I mentioned, and kind of just, really in the 1920s where the Chinatown here was destroyed, it was leveled, there was gonna be a yacht harbor built in Napa, which really never happened, and so that was destroyed. St. Helena one in 1900 was destroyed and leveled, as well as Calistoga, Chinatown was leveled. So there's a few artifacts actually in the Napa Valley Museum, next to Veterans Home. It's got a few artifacts from Chinatown, but like that's it. There's practically no physical remains at all. It's really quite something, which again, intentional or malicious, I don't really know, but it was very. Yes.
Didn't they build the gaze of Behringer also?
They may have. I mean, the Behringer crew has some.
Not
but-
a cruise, but across the Behringer.
Entirely possible. The only one that I actually was able to kind of see was the Behringer may have.
I think so.
Yerba Buena in Sonoma was the first one. They were actually in the 50s. The wine caves are also still working there, so they are around.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you for writing this book. Definitely needs to be let people know about the history. Thank you. I actually don't live here. I come from Santa Rosa. I drove here to attend this meeting.
Thank you very much for coming.
But I want to mention something about Sonoma. I don't live there, but Sonoma Valley, they also have a very strong wine industry, as you know, as competitors to you. They don't have any remnants of Chinatown. They don't even have graveyards. They were all called Chinamen, because many of them, well, for one thing, these laborers, as I heard, they come from San Francisco, further south, because they were finished with the gold rush and finished with the building of the railroad. But they haven't made a fortune, so they are ashamed to go home. That is generally the feeling. So they come here to look for work. And many of them, as you mentioned, they don't have children and so on. They just got buried and don't even have the names.
Right, no, it's I'm actually speaking in Sonoma next week. And we did look at the maps of because Sonoma Square, if you've ever been there. We have maps, we know there were Chinese businesses around the square, but they never coalesced into the Chinatowns, which I think was what Napa was interestingly had. I think Chinatowns gave them a sense of a place. I think in Sonoma, it was not, it was more spread out. And because also Sonoma was almost exclusively agricultural, so everything was very spread out. Napa was, as you saw, pretty industrial actually back then. So I think there were more concentrations. But yes, no, I agree. There's the same story to be told in Sonoma. Actually, there is no doubt. Yes.
Were you able to find any of the descendants of the merchants who didn't have families?
So I did not until 2 weeks ago. I did this presentation in Chinatown, and this woman named Amy Baldwin, who is a descendant of Chanwell Jack's brother. She came up, she lives in Berkeley, and she was so excited to talk about her thing. So yes, one. But could not find anybody else. Chanwell Jack, his descendant, his children, he had like 7 or 8 of them, are remarkably successful people. I mean, it was the first Asian Chinese lawyer ever with one of his children. One of his sons married a Chinese princess. It's credible, but I think they didn't stay around. They basically dispersed. So as far as I know, there are no living descendants of any Chinese person from that era still in Napa. They were all, I mean, we have now, of course, but they were not descendants. Yes.
So yeah, thanks for doing this. I definitely think that having done a little bit of this work in other areas, it's something that will grow. And so just like you met this woman a couple weeks ago, also with artifacts, I just learned from a friend that a local artist had acquired a cabinet from the apothecary in Napa, but it unfortunately burned when in fires. But there may be others, like
That's right.
as the word gets out, like if we carry this forward, say there are these artifacts, it happened with the Native Americans as well, as people learn like, oh, this is not good.
Yeah.
There may be a way that this grows, and then more books. I have a question though. Does anyone know, is the name French laundry, is that,
Based on actual laundry?
basically like-
That's a good question. I do not know.
Restaurant called.
I wanna
Yeah.
reinforce the message about artifacts. I come from a family that has been here as long as yours, and I know I have pictures of my father being cared for by a Chinese gentleman. I know, and because the family traveled into both China and Japan in the 1880s, 1890s, they brought back a lot of stuff, but they also have a lot of stuff. So I'd be happy to sit with somebody and try to search. And the other thing is, if you go up to Tulaque, there's actually, in addition to the area you're talking about, there's a more modern section where there's probably a dozen or so. And it's, my family is, the Dunlaps are right across the way, the street. And so when I go up there, there's often fruits and vegetables and things like that in bowls. So there's a pretty active engagement at the center.
Yeah, no, it's too okay. Well, us here is very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, I know we are running short of time. I don't want to keep you guys more than, we are, you have there, if you want to, don't feel obligated, of course, if you're interested in getting a book, a lot of everything I have there came from the book, so it's interesting. Happy to sign any too, if you'd like that, if you're happy to do that. And thank you so much for coming.